We have a lot to get to, and we start with that tragic news out of Atlanta. On Tuesday, a gunman killed 8 people, including 6 women of Asian descent. It comes as the country sees a rise in attacks against Asian Americans, and what we saw in Atlanta has many fearing of even more violence. So today, President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris traveled to Georgia, canceling a political event to meet with community leaders instead.
For the last year, we've had people in positions of incredible power scapegoating Asian Americans, people with the biggest pulpits spreading this kind of hate.
Words have consequences. It's the coronavirus, full stop.
What we don't know from authorities is if those killings were racially motivated. The police chief says it's too early to tell. But what we do know, racist attacks against Asian Americans are nothing new. For years, the community has been targeted, and it has only intensified during the pandemic. Former President Donald Trump blamed China for the virus. All of this happening as the Biden administration faces a growing problem with immigration and asylum seekers at the U.S.-Mexico border. So joining us tonight are 4 top reporters: Dan Balz, chief correspondent for The Washington Post; Laura Barrón-López, White House correspondent for Politico; Weijia Jiang, senior White House correspondent for CBS News; and Jacob Soboroff, correspondent for NBC News and MSNBC, and the author of the New York Times bestseller, Separated Inside an American Tragedy. Laura, I want to start with you. What is the latest after President Joe Biden's visit today, and where are we now?
Yeah, so what was really key in his speech today, Rachel, was the way he intersected all of those themes. He talked about systemic racism. He talked about the rise in hate crimes. He talked about also the impact of the relief bill that he just passed. And he tied a lot of it to Georgia, the state that he was in, and to the fact that Georgia, in its runoff, elected 2 Democratic senators, and that those 2 Democratic senators are going to be key not only in the relief bill that just passed and the fact that checks are now going to the American public, but also in passing the rest of his agenda. So he called on Congress to pass that COVID anti-hate crime bill. But again, when it comes to the Senate, that's going to be the big question, where those 2 Georgia senators are key, whether it's that anti-hate crime bill, whether it's immigration reform, whether it's voting rights. That is where Biden's agenda is going to meet the most resistance.
And yesterday, we did see Congress. They held its first hearing in over 3 decades on anti-Asian American discrimination. And you had a tense moment playing out. Republican Congressman Chip Roy and Democratic Congresswoman Grace Meng at odds over just how to address this issue.
My concern about this hearing is that it seems to want to venture into the policing of rhetoric in a free society, free speech.
Your president and your party and your colleagues can talk about issues with any other country that you want, but you don't have to do it by putting a bullseye on the back of Asian Americans across this country, on our grandparents, on our kids. This hearing was to address the hurt and pain of our community and to find solutions, and we will not let you take our voice away from us.
An emotional moment there in that hearing. Weijia, I want to turn to you on this. You have covered this extensively. These numbers are staggering. 3,800 incidents of hate against Asian Americans, against immigrants in this community. What are you hearing from people in the community? And is there a genuine fear that there is going to be more attacks?
You know, Rachel, I've talked to so many victims at this point, and they do fear for their lives, quite frankly, because they have been attacked before. They are survivors, and they understand what could have happened. And they've seen other people lose their lives after attacks on members of the Asian community. So while they are extremely grateful that President Biden and the administration has taken a very firm stance against the rhetoric surrounding COVID-19 that may have led to these attacks, and even though the president has made a commitment to do something, at this point, they want to know what that is, right? So they're calling for federal money, for example, to be, directed toward advocacy groups given to victims to handle the situation after they have been attacked. And they are calling on lawmakers to pass new legislation that would take concrete steps to make it easier to track these cases and easier to prosecute these cases. And so, even though there is some optimism, because obviously this is a very different tone than we saw from before, now they are waiting to see what comes out of it. Because even though words matter a lot, action is what they are looking for.
And just to follow up with you, Weijia, on that, because you pressed President Donald Trump against his words, against his rhetoric that he used to describe the virus, to describe the pandemic. We talk about words mattering. We heard from President Joe Biden today a very stark contrast, Weijia.
Right. So, I think when we look back at the way President Trump spoke about the virus, it really comes down to redirecting blame. The worse that the situation became here in the US, the more we saw him turn up the rhetoric because he wanted to, take attention away from his own administration's failed response. So we know this of the former president that he wants to control his own message and he wants to change the headline by creating distractions, which is why he did not shy away from using some controversial language. But at the end of it, when you look at why, it really is because, he wanted to blame another country, China in particular, for what was happening in the US, even though it was under his watch and even though it was the result of his missteps. And so I think that's why those words resonated so much with Asian Americans who believe that's why they're being targeted, because other Americans are also looking for a scapegoat, just like the president did.
Dan, I want to turn to you on the solutions. We heard from Weijia, people in the community, they want action. They don't just want words. We saw in Congress last week, the House did pass a measure that would address gun violence. But does this shooting change the conversation on gun violence and gun reform?
I think everybody would like to think that it would, but the history of this issue tells us that it probably won't. We have had horrific examples of gun violence that ultimately did not change anything in the law. The Sandy Hook shooting, where all the little kids were killed, President Obama and then Vice President Biden worked very hard to try to push Congress to pass legislation. It enjoyed overwhelming public support and nothing happened. After the Parkland shooting, nothing happened. We can go through repeated episodes of this and nothing does seem to get done. Perhaps this would be one that does change the nature of it, but I think that if you look at the history of it, you have to be skeptical that the outrage over the gun violence is going to change certain people in Congress to vote in a different way than they have in the past.